Hello, this is a special edition of Sermons for Snowbirds. Although this past weekend we had an exceptional scholar in residence, Rabbi Benjamin Blech, and so I did not deliver a sermon this past week. This is a special edition in order to comment on the current conflict between Hamas and Israel. You may notice that there's also another major change today because we've been having syncing problems with the webcam, in which the audio and video do not necessarily align very well with each other, and it looks a bit comical at times. Today we're just going to be doing an audio file, and maybe we're going to accompany it with a couple of pictures and maybe short videos to illustrate the points that are being made. But I just wanted to talk to you about the conflict in Israel. You know, as King Solomon famously says in Megillat Kohelet, in the book of Ecclesiastes, Eit milchama v'eit shalom. There's a time for peace and there's a time for war. And we as Jews know how precious a time for peace is. We know that it is forbidden ever to glorify war. In fact, we have the holiday of Hanukkah coming up, and one of the profound insights by the Meshech Chochma, by Rabbi Meir Simcha of Dvinsk in his famous work, the Meshech Chochma, one of his insights about Hanukkah is the fact that although Hanukkah really primarily commemorates a battle which the Jews won over the Seleucids, in which those Jews living in the land of Israel were able to reassert sovereignty, although it really in many ways commemorates a military victory, we choose, or the rabbis chose, to make the center point of Hanukkah the miracle of the menorah. The miracle of the menorah lighting for 8 days. Although that would seemingly be a far less meaningful miracle in terms of its historical impact. And Rabbi Meir Simcha of Dvinsk explains that as Jews we never glorify war. We have a rule that whenever a human being is dying, that human being is one of God's children. Ma'aseh yadai tovim bayam, as the famous passage in the Talmud says. How can you sing when my own creations, my own children, are drowning in the sea? This is what the Talmud talks about when the Egyptians are drowning in the Red Sea. And so we understand that as Jews we never celebrate the death of any human being, even if it's the death of an enemy. It's a very important point. As Jews we understand that we must keep our ethical standards even in the most difficult times. The state of Israel has always prided itself on its toar neshek, on the fact that the arms are carried in a pure fashion, or what's called the purity of arms. And although there are many that like to slander the state of Israel, and like to say, well, civilians are dying, the Israelis must want that, it is only the opposite that is true. In 2006, I went to visit the family of Yaniv Baron. Yaniv Baron was the son and grandson of Montrealers. His mother had made Aliyah. He had been one of the first casualties of the war against Hezbollah in Lebanon in 2006. And when I went to visit his family, one of the things that remains etched in my mind is that they showed me proudly the card that he had, which included his code of ethics. Every Israeli soldier is given a small card that folds up with all of the various ethical obligations that are incumbent upon that soldier. And of course, Toar HaNeshek, wielding arms in a pure fashion, avoiding at every cost and every possibility the incidence of any casualty or any death to civilians, is something that is so critical to the Israeli army. And although there are those who like to slander the Israelis, the truth is the exact opposite. In the city of Jenin, when Israel had to go in 2002, they had to go into Jenin, and they did so in order to defend themselves. There were just so many suicide bombings. So initially, of course, there was a slander that Israel had actually killed civilians intentionally. That, of course, proved to be untrue. It was the contrary that was true. Israel had given up the lives of 23 soldiers to do everything possible to protect the civilian population in Jenin. We don't glorify war. We do everything we can to wage war in an ethical fashion. And for Jews and for Israelis, peace is the greatest value. The Midrash remarks in Vayikra Rabbah Gadol HaShalom. Peace is remarkably great. It's greater than every other mitzvah, and the Midrash goes on and on recounting various proofs to prove how important peace is. And this is reflected in the modern state of Israel. I like to remind people over and over again, there is only one Declaration of Independence in the world that includes within it a paragraph requesting peace from its neighbors, and that is Israel's Declaration of Independence. Israel, in her Declaration of Independence, turns to her neighbors and says, we desire peace. We want to live alongside you for the mutual benefit of everyone. Let's make all of our lives together. This invitation, which was offered in 1948, has remained on the table since. But instead, there's been no peace. And one needs to comprehend fully the situation to understand why there's no peace. On November 11th and 12th, Hamas launched 125 rockets at the south of Israel. This was before Israel had done anything. The killing of Ahmad Jabari was merely a response to those launching of rockets, and Israel hoped at that moment that would end all attacks on Israel. But, of course, Hamas chose to escalate the conflict. Now, this is something that you have to understand, that Hamas is fully committed to the obliteration and destruction of the state of Israel. Their leaders are proud of the fact that Israelis seem to like life, while they love death. And for them, it is not only a personal desire, but it is a religious responsibility to wipe Israel off the face of the earth and to essentially bring the end to the Jewish state in the Jewish homeland. Now, since 2005, when Israel disengaged from the Gaza Strip, Hamas has launched no less than 11,000 rocket attacks on Israel. There is no country in the world that could tolerate that type of attacks. And this is absolutely brutal. You know, what's interesting is that Hamas is not only brutal towards Israelis, they're brutal towards Palestinians. Not only in forcing them to endure a constant state of war with Israel, where so many suffer and too many die. That's not only it. Hamas themselves go out and kill Palestinians. You know that in the moment that Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip, which was in 2006 and 2007, notice it was right after Israel left, Hamas engaged in a war with Fatah. And in that war, Hamas killed 165 Palestinians and wounded over 1,000 others. The Hamas treatment of fellow Palestinians is so shocking that there was a fellow by the name of Musab Hassan Youssef. Musab Hassan Youssef is the son of Sheikh Hassan Youssef. If you're not familiar with the name, Sheikh Hassan Youssef is one of the founders of Hamas. And Musab Hassan Youssef, who was being groomed to be one of the princes of Hamas, to be one of its leaders, what Musab Hassan Youssef did was end up in an Israeli prison. In the Israeli prison, he looked around at the treatment he got, and trust me, it was not gentle. But in the Israeli prison, he compared the treatment that he got with the way that Hamas treated fellow Palestinians that they had imprisoned. And he realized, he came to an understanding that, oh my goodness, the Israelis have more ethics than we do. The Israelis care more about Palestinians than Hamas does. Now this is something that not only transformed his life, it made him into a celebrity. He decided at that moment that he was going to defy his father, defy his background, he was going to spy for the Shin Bet, and that he was going to leave Islam. He could no longer be a Muslim after what he had seen Hamas do. Now Hamas is not only brutal, Hamas is committed to the destruction of Israel, but more so, Hamas is committed to the destruction of Jews and Judaism. You just have to go on to the MEMRI website, MEMRI, the Middle East Media Research Institute. And there are countless statements by leaders of Hamas on Hamas TV, with Hamas sanction, not only about how they hate Israel and they want to obliterate Israel, and how they're against Zionists, but how they are against Jews. Just this past July, a Hamas member of parliament, in an interview on Hamas TV, went on to state how the Germans had punished the Jews, and now it was the turn of the Islamic nation to punish the Jews. This is a blatant anti-Semitic statement, but it shouldn't be a shock. In the Hamas covenant itself, it quotes a passage from Muslim tradition which talks about the end of days. In the end of days, Jews will hide behind rocks and trees, and the rocks and trees will call out to believers in Islam and say, "There's a Jew hiding behind me, kill him, murder him." This is in the Hamas covenant, a blatant anti-Semitic statement. It should be no shock that Hamas refuses any sort of ceasefire that will enable Israel and Hamas to ultimately live at peace side by side. Hamas is not interested in a two-state solution. Hamas isn't even interested in a one-state solution. Hamas is interested in a one-religion solution. We need to be aware of who is causing this disturbance, and we need to be aware of how radical they are. As many have already pointed out before me, if someone is calling for a genocide, take them at their word. Don't assume that they're just acting in a remarkably exaggerated fashion. Take them at their word. It's not a time for peace, and that's why it must be a time for war. You know, I got an email from one of our members, Naomi Niederhofer, who spoke about how she was stuck in a basement in the first days of the conflict in Kibbutz Sa'ad, which is in the south of Israel, about what it's like to constantly sit there reading your Tehillim, and then because she's volunteered to be a medic, she would run out when times were sort of peaceful to see if she could go out and help people while wearing her helmet and flak jacket. I got another email from Sean Astor, another member of ours who had moved to Israel and moved to Beersheba. And he wrote an email writing about his experiences fleeing from Beersheba so that he can take his children to safety, because far too many rockets have been landing on Beersheba, Montreal's sister city. And I thought about these two emails, and it really hurt, because the very purpose of the state of Israel is that Jews shouldn't have to flee anymore. Jews shouldn't have to live in basements anymore. Too many times in Jewish history, Jews have had to hide in attics and in basements. They've had to flee from place to place to avoid their pursuers. Too many times in Jewish history, people have tried to murder Jews simply because they're Jewish. The entire purpose of the state of Israel, the entire idea and dream of having a state for Jews, is that Jews should have one place in the world where they can walk the street in safety and never worry about anti-Semitism. And that is why these attacks are so unacceptable. The Jewish state is founded on the principle of the sovereignty of Jews. How dare anyone lob rockets at Jews in the Jewish homeland, in the Jewish state? And that is why Israelis have to protect themselves. Pacifism with people like Hamas will not work. Acting in a fashion that says, we'll let you do whatever you want, acting in a passive fashion, will not in any way disengage Hamas. It will just enrage them more. And we need to protect ourselves, because this is the Jewish homeland. This is the Jewish state. And Jews have the right to defend themselves. Many years ago, Gabi Ashkenazi, who was later going to become the chief of staff of the Israeli army, came to visit our synagogue. And he came to speak about the strategic situation, and he gave a lecture. And the gentleman who brought Gabi Ashkenazi told me, he says, go ask him about Entebbe. Gabi Ashkenazi was at Entebbe. For those of you who aren't aware, there was a major hostage rescue staged by the Israeli army at Entebbe in Uganda. It was an incredibly perilous rescue in which all of the soldiers that went on this hostage rescue to get the hostages away from the terrorists were really putting their lives on the line. And so I raised my hand and I turned to Gabi Ashkenazi and I say, I understand you were in Entebbe. Please tell me something about that rescue. What was it like for you as a soldier? So Gabi Ashkenazi looked at me and he said, Rabbi, you should know Entebbe was not the most dangerous operation I was involved in. I was a commando. We were involved in, I was a paratrooper. We were involved in so many far more dangerous rescues, far more dangerous operations. He says, but I'll tell you what Entebbe was special. What was special about Entebbe? Entebbe sticks out in my mind, Gabi Ashkenazi said, because it reminded me why I am an Israeli. He said that when I walked in the door, I was an Israeli soldier. Now the hostages had no idea that Israel was coming. And when I walked in the door for the first split second, the hostages assumed that I was a Ugandan soldier. The hostages assumed that actually they were about to be moved and executed. And there was a look of incredible fear in their eyes for that first split second. And then the hostages were able to see the Israeli flag on my uniform. And at that moment, the look in their eyes, the look of relief, the look of joy, at that moment I understood what it means to be an Israeli. What it means to be an Israeli is to be responsible for Jews around the world. What it means to be an Israeli is to ensure that every Jew can live in peace. If Gabi Ashkenazi is going to ensure that every Jew can live in peace in Israel and around the world, we need to ensure that every Jew can live in peace in Israel. It is our job to support Israel in her time of need. We need to pray for her, we need to pray for peace, and we need to hope that at some point the Palestinians get rid of Hamas and get rid of Hamas's ideology so that we truly can have peace in the Middle East in our time.